Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentovich with the New God's Physics Paradigm for 21st Century. This is a book that's been published by iUniverse.com. There's been over 50 peer-reviewed scientific articles published over the last 5 years, 2 special issues. I'm being invited to open international conferences in physics, theoretical physics, with this keynote lecture about the new paradigm of 21st century theoretical physics. The topic of today's talk or presentation is that we stand at a historic time where God's physics new paradigm is being accepted by science as a new paradigm for 21st century theoretical physics. And I'm also going to speak about in the last special issue, the recent special issue, there's been over 17 articles published, as well as in the God's Physics book. And one of these articles speaks about a Geula-directed goal universe, goal Geula-directed universe. So I'm going to speak about these things, but the major thing is really to understand that we're standing at a historic time. This time is for all practical purposes, it's equivalent precisely equivalent to Einstein's revolution 100 years ago. And as I've spoken about this in the previous presentations, the famous philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn already analyzed and identified the way that science evolves. And it's very exciting, actually, quite exciting, because we can see the same precise progression taking place. No doubt it's not simple for science to make such a paradigmatic shift. So I'm just reminding the viewers that Thomas Kuhn identified the fact that science and more precisely scientists have a way of evolving. He looked at the evolution of science from a sociological and philosophical standpoint, and he pointed out that scientists, as other human beings, have a difficulty to make a major change. But in science, it's necessary, because science is the discipline that humanity has adopted to pursue and investigate truth and reach the ultimate truth behind and beyond the universe. So when science is reaching a point where it can no longer explain, the old paradigm cannot any longer explain how the universe operates, that begs and pushes scientists and science more generally to adopt such a paradigmatic shift. And I'm saying that we're standing at a historic time because imagine what happened 100 years ago when Einstein came along and science was stuck. Science was at a point where Newtonian mechanics, Maxwellian electromagnetic theory seemed contradictory of each other. Science could not explain the basis, one of the fundamental bases of the Newtonian mechanics, which was the hypothetical existence of the ether. And numerous attempts and experiments like the Michelson-Morley experiment have been made, and none of them was able to detect the ether. So at that point it became very clear that science and the old paradigm of Newtonian mechanics cannot any longer hold. Excuse me. And so we stand at a historic time, because now, as then, 100 years ago, when in 1919 Eddington came along, the famous British astronomer, came along and was willing to make that decisive test of a critical prediction that Einstein had in his general relativity theory. That critical prediction regarded the curvature of the pathway of Mercury, the closest planet to the Sun. The pathway, the Perihelion pathway around the Sun of Mercury, was a critical test case, so to speak, for Einstein's back then new general relativity theory. And even though, and again, this is what Thomas Kuhn is telling us, and this is why we're standing at a very historic time, because even though it's very difficult for scientists to make that leap, in other words, when we have the old paradigm like Newtonian mechanics and it's not working any longer, and then science has to, because science got the mandate from humanity, so to speak, to pursue the investigation of truth, to get at closer and closer approximations and understanding of what is the truth behind the universe. So when science is getting stuck in a wall, against the wall, so to speak, at that point, science has to make that paradigmatic shift, has to expand its gaze and say, okay, Newtonian mechanics was fine for a while, but now it's not working any longer. And at that point, the critical prediction that Einstein identified, which was the double-valued curvature of Mercury's pathway around the Sun, relative or in contrast to Newtonian mechanics prediction, again due to Einstein's discovery of the fact that massive objects curve space and time. So when Einstein identified that critical prediction, and he called astronomers and cosmologists, just as I'm doing now, and have been doing now for a little bit, in those 17 articles, 2 special issues. Now I've recorded quite a few presentations, and I'm presenting that also in international conferences, and I'm urgently calling cosmologists and astronomers to carry out a similar time-sensitive critical prediction of the new God's physics paradigm, which I'm going to just mention briefly again. But where we're at now is that we understand that when Einstein identified a critical prediction that differentiated his new back then new relativity theory, new paradigm of the universe relative to Newtonian mechanics, that prediction is different. Einstein is saying it's 1.6 arc, Newton is saying it's 0.8, and one of them is correct. Obviously they can't both be correct. So then at that point Einstein called astronomers and cosmologists to carry out the critical prediction and validate and determine whether in fact Einstein's new theory, new paradigm of the 20th century physics is more valid than Newtonian mechanics. And Eddington, a bold British astronomer, and 2 other expeditions set out to test this critical prediction. And in fact Eddington found out that truly Einstein's prediction was correct and not Eddington's prediction. And then overnight again, general relativity theory was accepted as the new paradigm of 20th century physics. Obviously it advanced science's understanding of the universe tremendously, and it opened for humanity great new vistas to understand the universe and understand that the speed of light is constant, that phenomena space-time is unified, the curvatures of space-time by massive objects, etc. And we stand right now at an equivalent point, precisely equivalent point. That's why it's an exciting historic time, because on the one hand it's quite clear that the old paradigm, the material causal paradigm, is crashing. It's not working any longer, and science cannot tolerate, humanity cannot tolerate for long such a situation. A situation in which up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe cannot be accounted for according to the old material causal paradigm, apropos of Einstein's general relativity theory and of quantum mechanics. It cannot explain where up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe is, simply because we know, astronomers and cosmologists have identified the fact that the universe is expanding, and it is expanding at an accelerated rate, but still it's a constant accelerated rate of expansion. And when astronomers and when physicists, theoretical physicists, try to explain the rate of that acceleration, they have to assume that there exists within the universe up to 95% more mass and energy than what we can actually detect. So that means that the old material causal paradigm is relying on 95% additional mass and energy in the universe that cannot be detected, and the way that the old paradigm is trying to somehow fit that major gap in our understanding, those 95% of mass and energy that are missing in the universe, so to speak. So they're termed these 95% of mass and energy that cannot be accounted for are hypothetically assumed to be dark matter, dark energy. Now, after 2 decades of numerous attempts to identify that purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy, which cannot be detected, 2 decades of experimentation have yielded no results, no direct verification or validation of those 95% assumed additional mass and energy in the universe. And as we spoke previously, there is a major theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which are the 2 pillars of the old material causal paradigm. And so the New Gods Physics, again with over 50 peer-reviewed scientific articles, 2 special issues dedicated to this new paradigm of the 21st century, multiple conferences, physics conferences, in which I'm opening them with a keynote talk, and initial validation, by the way, of this New Gods Physics paradigm through the proton radius puzzle, which I published previously. So it's quite clear that God's physics, or the computational unified field theory, it's been as it has been called previously, the New God's Physics paradigm, or computational unified field theory, is quite clearly the best candidate for the new 21st century paradigm for theoretical physics. So much so that we've reached a point now, because it can resolve the inconsistency between quantum mechanics and relativity theory. I'll talk more about the ramifications, and especially this Geula Goal directed universe, which is an exciting and appealing and fascinating new conception of the universe. But it's clear that the new paradigm is able to resolve the inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. It's able to do things that were not achieved by the old paradigm, such as a complete unification of space-time, energy, and mass, and complete unification of an explanation accounting for the 4 forces of nature, a transcending of the speed of light barrier, a possibility to reverse time, which was not a possibility in relativity theory, etc., etc. So at this point, science and scientists, cosmologists and astronomers are urgently called to validate, to supply another validation, because I said an initial validation was already given by the proton radius puzzle findings, which were in a sense predicted as a critical prediction by the New Gods Physics paradigm. But we want a direct critical prediction verification, and that is what I've called cosmologists and astronomers, and urgently calling them in press, in video presentations, in communications. I'm calling cosmologists and astronomers to take this valuable and historic time and make that critical prediction validation. That is, as I explained in previous talks and in many of the articles, due to one of the unique theoretical postulates of the New Gods Physics paradigm, which I call the collective human consciousness focus, due to the discovery of the new singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP. That's the major discovery made by God's physics, that we understand that there is a new higher ordered UCP, universal consciousness principle or computational principle, that simultaneously computes every spatial pixel in the universe. And it thereby creates a series of frames, like in a somewhat similar to a film, and I've used this cinematic film metaphor. It creates a series of universal frames. Each universal frame comprises the whole universe, a 3-dimensional picture or frame of the whole universe at a minimal time point. At the minimal time point of a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second, the UCP is computing and producing simultaneously a frame, the whole reality of the universe simultaneously. And then it dissolves back into this universal consciousness principle, and it's like the pulsation of the heart, so to speak. The UCP produces the world simultaneously as a universal frame, then it retracts it or dissolves it back into the UCP, and then again it produces a more evolved frame of the universe. So this major discovery made by the God's Physics new paradigm, essentially that plus the understanding that there cannot be any material causal interaction in the universe, because every universal frame is produced simultaneously, and between the frames it dissolves back into the UCP. So it negates, it challenges some of our basic assumptions, the old material causal basic assumptions of relativity theory's Big Bang model, of the curvature of a space-time by massive objects, etc., etc. So when we understand the new God's physics paradigm tells us the universe is produced by this universal consciousness principle at the incredible rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant, which gives us 1.36 in the power of minus 50, many trillions of times per second. And the second point is that this universal consciousness principle is affected by a collective human consciousness focus. For the first time in the evolution of physics and science more generally, human consciousness has become a major element in the sustenance and development and goal of the physical universe, which I'm going to speak about briefly, because that relates to this Geula Goal directed universe, universal consciousness principle, Geula Goal directed universe. It has an aim, it has a goal. It's driving the universe towards this perfected Geula state. And human beings, which possess a free moral choice, have a central role in that development and in attaining that perfected Geula Goal state. But I'm trying to focus now on this critical prediction and explain briefly where it's derived from and why, again, this is a historic time for cosmologists, astronomers to validate this new God's physics paradigm of the 21st century. So the idea is, excuse me, so the idea is that this collective human consciousness focus theoretical postulate, which essentially says that whenever you have a large group of individuals, of human beings, all focusing together on this universal consciousness principle, in religious terms we would call it God. Whenever you have this collective human consciousness focus of millions or billions of individuals focusing on this collective, on this universal consciousness principle, that brings about a non-continuous expansion of the universe. And that non-continuous expansion, accelerated expansion of the universe is predicted. That's a critical prediction of the new God's physics paradigm. And I took the closest example that I know of, which is the Jewish Rosh Hashana New Year, in which millions of Jews, in fact, focus for 2 days, focus on this universal consciousness reality, or God in religious terms. For 2 days, millions of Jews are focusing and praying to this universal consciousness reality, God. And so I predicted, and I'm calling cosmologists, astronomers all over the world to do what Eddington has done for science and for humanity 100 years ago. And that is to set out and measure the rate of acceleration of the universe a certain while before Rosh Hashana, let's say 2 weeks before Rosh Hashana. Rosh Hashana this year is on the 7th and 8th of September 2021. So I'm calling astronomers and cosmologists to carry out a measurement of 2 weeks, say 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the 7th and 8th of September, during the 7th, 8th, and after the 7th, 8th of September, and contrast the rate of acceleration of the universe before the 7th, 8th, and from the 7th, 8th onwards. And the prediction, the critical, unique prediction of God's physics paradigm is that during the 7th, 8th, and following and ensuing after that, there will be a leap, a non-continuous leap in the rate of acceleration of the universe. To the extent, due to this collective human consciousness focus, and due to the action, so to speak, of the universal consciousness reality, which based on this collective human consciousness focus decides or brings about a non-continuous, a leap in the rate of acceleration of the universe. To the extent that this will be validated by one of the bold scientists, astronomers or cosmologists that I'm calling to test this critical prediction, unique critical prediction of God's physics, then overnight God's physics will have to be accepted as the new God, the new 21st century paradigm for theoretical physics, just as general relativity theory was accepted after its validation by Eddington's bold 1919 solar eclipse measurement. So this is why we stand at a very historic time. This is why it's so urgent for astronomers, cosmologists to carry out this unique critical prediction. There's been another critical prediction, which I called experimental physicists, to measure the rate at which more massive objects appear relative to less massive objects, and that's a whole story in and of itself, which can be and should be validated in subatomic accelerators. But what I'm talking about now, which is time sensitive, about the measurement of the non-continuous increase in the universe's accelerated expansion, that's very important because we're coming very close to that period of time where this can be measured. Now let me explain to you a little bit about this fascinating new paradigm, the new God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm, and how it advances, significantly advances our understanding of the universe. And I'll try in next presentations also to cover it's a whole new universe. One of the 50 plus peer-reviewed scientific articles was called the New God's Physics 21st Century, a new science, a new universe, because it truly is revealing before our eyes a new science, a new universe, and a new science. So I'll try a little bit to explain this thing about why this is such an exciting paradigmatic shift. If we want to understand briefly, or in the essence of what is the difference between the ramifications, the theoretical ramifications of the old material causal paradigm and the new God's physics paradigm, we get the principal difference is that the old material causal paradigm tells us that the universe is like a huge clock. It's like a mechanical instrument, so to speak. So if we imagine the huge clock ticking, the various components within that clock determine how the clock would tick and how it would move, how it would measure time. So it's a mechanical interaction. And the old material causal paradigm is essentially saying that the universe is a huge clock, is a huge machine. It operates just by the interactions between physical elements, material elements within it, and those material elements bring about its progression. And beyond the fact that I've discovered, that was one of the initial discoveries of this new God's physics or computational unified field theory. I called it the duality principle, in which I explained that in the same way that you cannot have a human being, imagine yourself standing on the floor and trying to pull yourself by the strings of your hair while you're standing on the floor. You cannot do that, obviously. You need somebody else that is outside of you to lift you up. Archimedes is known to have said, the Archimedes point, said, "Give me a point outside Earth and I shall lift Earth." That's the same idea. Gödel's incompleteness theory and logic mathematics pointed at the same idea. And the duality principle, essentially at the beginning of this development of this computational unified field theory or new God's physics paradigm, pointed at the fact that we must have something outside this mechanical clock, this material universe, that is actually producing the universe and that is actually evolving the universe. This is a side note. It's a philosophical computational consideration, but still, for the general viewers, it's a point worthwhile thinking about, that the old material causal paradigm simply cannot work because it's trying to determine how the universe is working from within the universe. And we need something that is outside the universe, so to speak, that can measure, that can evolve, that can determine how the universe evolves. But I'm putting this aside. What I'm saying is that the old material causal paradigm essentially says that the universe is a mechanical clock, so to speak. It's been evolved and it's been created by a random nuclear event, the Big Bang event, which created space-time and energy that's pushing the galaxy and the suns apart from each other. Also, it's assumed that there's dark matter, dark energy, which are completely hypothetical and cannot be detected. And in any event, it's a cause and effect, it's a material interaction and cause and effect that's causing the universe to evolve. The new God's physics paradigm is saying, first, the old model doesn't work. And we said that a few times about the inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, about the fact that it cannot explain where 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe exist or are. So we must go beyond that. Just as Einstein, 100 years ago, when he saw that the ether concept, which is completely hypothetical, could not be detected, and that there was a contradiction between Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian theory. When he saw that, he said we must expand and use a new model, which is what he did. And so God's physics new paradigm is saying, okay, the way to get out and expand our understanding of the universe is to discover that singular higher order universal consciousness principle. This universal consciousness principle is evolving the universe so many trillions of times. It's producing the whole universe, computing every spatial pixel, every point in the universe. Very difficult for us to comprehend that, but still that's the new paradigm, that this universal consciousness principle or computational principle is computing simultaneously every point in the universe, and it's producing this extremely rapid series of universal frames every trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second, etc. 50 zeros, that's many trillions of times. So every trillions of a second, the universal computational consciousness principle is producing the whole universe as a universal frame. Then it's dissolving it back to itself, and then it's producing a new frame that is a little bit more evolved than the old frame. So this new paradigm is putting the emphasis solely on this higher ordered singular universal consciousness principle, which is producing the universe and evolving the universe. And it's actually undermining the basic material causal assumption, as I've indicated many times, that there cannot be a cause and effect. So the Big Bang is negated. There cannot be a cause and effect because the universal consciousness principle is computing simultaneously everything. And in between the frames it's dissolving, so you cannot have any physical interaction between one frame and another frame. So what we're getting at is we're seeing that essentially the universal consciousness principle is solely responsible for the sustenance of the universe, for its evolution, and this is what I want to speak about a little bit today in the brief time that we have left, which is the universal consciousness principle has planned from the beginning, it's planned the evolution of the universe towards its perfected Geula state. And that perfected Geula state is the aim of the universal consciousness principle. So we're getting at the point where we understand the universe has not been created by a random nuclear event. It's not evolved simply by material interaction. It's actually being evolved continuously towards the perfected Geula state. Excuse me. In that perfected Geula state, I want to speak about this. So the pre-planned program that the universal consciousness principle has for evolving the whole universe towards the perfected state is, in a sense, evolving the consciousness from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings. It's all expanding the consciousness. And taking humanity, human beings, towards the perfected Geula state. That perfected Geula state is where, in a sense, science is now standing. That's why this historic time, a point in time, is very critical. Because the perfected Geula state is that state in which two things happen. First of all, the moral principle, which is for the first time in science and physics, becomes a major principle. I call it the dynamic equilibrium moral principle, which means that for every human being at every point in time, the moral choice that human being makes, good or bad, in other words, benefiting another human being or causing, God forbid, pain or suffering to another human being or discomfort, that moral choice actually brings about corresponding selection by the universal consciousness principle of one of multiple possible futures for that individual human being, depending on the moral choice that he or she made. So if a human being is now, God forbid, inflicting pain on another human being, because the moral principle is so essential and characterizes this universal consciousness reality, it's all oneness, it's all harmonious, it's all peace embedded. And so whenever there is a moral action that inflicts pain on another human being, that brings about immediately, or not immediately, but that brings about that the universal consciousness principle selects one of multiple possible futures, in which, in that case, that individual would have to, in a sense, experience the same kind of pain or suffering, not as a punishment, by the way, but as a way of teaching us that we're all part of this universal consciousness reality, that the moral principle is key within that reality. So the progression, and by the way, vice versa. If a person then bestows goodness and helps and assists another human being, the universal consciousness reality would select a corresponding future, one of multiple possible futures, that would reward, so to speak, that individual and teach him or her again how right this is, that we're all part of the same reality. And in fact, that moral principle is leading humanity, alongside the development of science, by the way, leading humanity to the point where we get to the Geula Goal State, perfected state. That's a state of perfection, morally, spiritually, and even physically. One of the articles that I wrote was about the possibility of the abolishment of death, and physical perfection may be that as well. So the perfected Geula State Goal is a state in which humanity and science recognize what this new God's physics paradigm is actually teaching us, that there is really one reality, one singular reality. That's the universal consciousness reality. And that singular, higher ordered universal consciousness reality is producing the universe. Actually, the universe is a manifestation, a transient phenomenal manifestation of the singular universal conscious reality. I'll speak about this one other time, God willing. But the idea is that the Geula Goal perfected state is a state in which humanity and science will recognize the oneness of this universal conscious reality. And embedded within this is that humanity will live and lead a life of moral perfection, in which there will not be wars, violence, etc. Because the same way that a human being, a sane, healthy human being, would not use the right hand to inflict pain on the left hand, because it's part of the same human being. The same way, in a sense, humanity and science will reach the point where it will become so clear that there is oneness, that there is only one singular higher ordered reality, that we're part of it, and humanity is playing a very central role. Humanity science is playing a very central role within that new God's physics paradigm, and not by accident but by personal providence. It's come to the point where the critical prediction of God's physics paradigm, now that I'm calling cosmologists, astronomers to test, that critical prediction is essentially telling us that the collective human consciousness focus, such as in the Rosh Hashana Jewish New Year, that plays a major role in the sense that it draws the will or the wish of the universal conscious reality to produce a whole bank, so to speak, of the whole universe for the next year, allowing the universe to evolve towards that Geula perfected state. And so humanity is playing a very major role, both in the moral principle that every moral choice that we're making selects for us one of multiple possible futures, and also that humanity, by this collective human consciousness focus on the universal conscious reality, is actually drawing and allowing the universe to evolve, because that's creating the will or the wish of this universal conscious reality to create another whole year of universal frames that would evolve and allow humanity to perfect itself and reach that perfected Geula Goal State. And that's why we stand at such a historic time, because this historic time, first of all, it's parallel or equivalent to what happened with Einstein 100 years ago, and it's really a must for cosmologists and astronomers to verify and validate the critical prediction now in Rosh Hashana. And second of all, when it's verified, God willing, this would bring about an understanding, a huge leap for humanity and for science, unifying the four forces of nature, unifying the four basic physical features of space-time, energy, and mass, and especially starting to study and investigate and embrace that singular, higher ordered universal consciousness reality, which is moral, which is driving the universe from its onset towards the perfected Geula state, to drive the universe and humanity towards a perfected Geula state. So we stand at a very historic time, very exciting time, and again, I'm calling all astronomers, cosmologists to carry out this critical prediction, which would allow science and humanity to test and hopefully validate this new God's physics paradigm, which gives us great hope, purpose, and meaning in our lives. And for science, it's a huge leap and expansion of our understanding. Thank you very much.